1 week after I buried my wife of 40 years, my son and his wife called a meeting to take everything I had left. My name is Jacob Peterson. I'm 65 years old, and this isn't a story about grief. It's a story about war. They sat across from me in the boardroom built on my sweat and my wife's soul, and Brenda, my daughter-in-law, smiled a smile colder than a Chicago winter. "Now that the old woman is gone," she said, "you'll sign the company over to my husband and learn to fend for yourself." I smiled back, because she didn't know my lawyer was walking through that door with a sealed envelope that would burn her entire world down. Kenji Ishikawa's appearance dropped the temperature in that room 10 degrees. Brenda hadn't expected legal counsel at her ambush. "What a surprise," she said, sarcasm dripping. I kept my voice flat. "This is business, Brenda. Kenji is always present for important business meetings." My son Ryan shifted in his seat, useless as ever. "Dad, what Brenda meant was..." She cut him off without even a glance. Then she turned back to me, dropping the mask, all corporate raider now. Ryan had been COO for 10 years. It was the next logical step. It's what Carol would have wanted. She used my wife's name to justify her greed, and something hot coiled in my gut. But Carol had taught me never to let them see you sweat. Let them see you think. I looked at my son. "Is that what you think, Ryan? Your mother would want me to hand over everything she bled for, a week after her funeral?" He couldn't meet my eyes. A memory hit me. Carol and I on the floor of a rented apartment 40 years ago, spreading bills across the carpet, the smell of truck grease under my fingernails from a 16-hour day driving the one rig we owned on a second mortgage. Ryan's hands had never held anything heavier than a 5-iron. Brenda pushed harder, pointing to performance reports, to the months I'd let things slide, while Carol was dying. She'd been building her case for months, waiting for my wife to take her last breath. I stood, palms flat on the table. "I am the CEO and chairman of the board. Ryan will remain COO, that is final. I own 51% of the voting shares. I am the board." Brenda stormed out, dragging a silent Ryan behind her, hissing that I was a relic who belonged in a museum. I didn't go home. The silence in that house would have been too loud. Instead, I drove to a small coffee shop and sat across from Kenji. "Start with any vendor or consultant hired without my approval," I told him. "Any new accounts opened in the last 18 months. Let her think I'm weak, while she plans her coronation, build her gallows." 20 years as my lawyer, he didn't ask why. As he wrote, my mind drifted to Carol a year earlier, on our back porch, frowning after Ryan and Brenda pitched a marketing plan. "I don't trust her, Jake," she'd said. "She looks at Ryan and doesn't see a husband. She sees a stock option." I'd dismissed it as a mother being protective. She'd seen the vulture in Brenda long before I did, and I'd let her down by not listening. 3 days of forced normalcy passed. Meetings, projections, a company that suddenly felt like hostile territory. I slept on the couch in my home office. I couldn't bear our bedroom yet. On the 4th day, Kenji called, his voice stripped of warmth. "I found something. It's bad." A shell corporation, registered in Delaware, called B&R Consulting. Brenda and Ryan. They hadn't even bothered to be clever. For 22 months, B&R had billed Peterson Freight for vague services, market analysis, logistics reports, each invoice just under the threshold requiring my signature, each one approved solely by Ryan. Non-existent services, ghost invoices. While I was holding Carol's hand through chemo, they were writing fiction to drain the company that built her legacy. "How much?" I asked. Kenji paused. $812,450. I remembered Carol, a year before, frowning at a line item on a quarterly report. "This consulting fee seems high, Jake," and me waving it off. She'd seen it. Of course she had. The money had gone to a down payment on a ski chalet in Aspen, deeded to Brenda alone, and a Porsche 911, registered in her name. They were living a fantasy, funded by lies, on the back of the woman who'd given her life to build that company. "Get everything," I told Kenji. "Every dime, every statement." The grief in my chest now had company. A cold, clear, righteous anger. This was no longer a boardroom dispute. It was a crime scene. But $800,000, ugly as it was, felt incomplete. Carol had been suspicious months before the stealing got this bad. I needed to understand what she knew, and there was only one person left who'd been inside those final days with us: Maria Sanchez, her private nurse. I found her tending roses in Pilsen. She pulled me into a hug more real than anything I'd received in weeks. Over chamomile tea, she told me Carol had changed in her last 2 months. Secretive. Private calls with Kenji. Old company ledgers pulled down from the attic, not for reminiscing, but for investigation. It doesn't add up, Carol kept muttering, hunched over a magnifying glass while dying. Maria hadn't wanted to tell me. Carol had sworn her to silence, not wanting to add to my pain, unless I needed to fight. But she went inside and came back with a small tarnished key. If he ever needs the whole truth, Carol had told her, this will be his shield and his sword. It belonged to a safe deposit box at First National Bank, opened decades before Carol and I ever married. The next morning, I stood in a cold vault, holding box 31B, opened in 1979, before I'd even met my wife. Inside, no jewels, no cash, just paper. A photograph of a young Carol I'd never seen, a bundle of letters, and underneath, 2 documents that stopped my heart. A birth certificate for Ryan Peterson. Father, Jacob Peterson. Mother, a name from a life I'd buried 45 years ago, not Carol. Beneath it, adoption papers, dated 6 months later, transferring full parental rights to Carol Chenoweth. And at the bottom, a leather diary in Carol's young, hopeful handwriting. I read it in that vault, my hands shaking. 2 months before our wedding, she'd learned that a drunken mistake I'd made 9 months earlier had produced a child. I'd told her it was a lie, a shakedown. I'd lied to her. She hadn't believed me. She'd followed me, watched me hand cash to a broken young woman, and seen the baby, tiny, in a dirty blanket. Not a mistake anymore. A person. Jake's son. She confronted me. I broke down and confessed everything. She had a choice. Leave, justified, or stay, and raise another woman's child as her own. She chose to stay, not for me, she wrote, but for the boy. Her one condition: he would never know the truth. He would only know he was her son, loved fiercely enough that the lie became the truth. The diary followed years of devotion, his first steps, his first word, circled and underlined 3 times. She hadn't just adopted Ryan, she'd claimed him with a love more powerful than blood. And near the end, an entry from 5 years ago, after his wedding, something hard about that girl, something calculating. She looks at Ryan like a stepping stone. Maybe I made him too soft to see it in others. I sat in that vault and wept, for her strength, my blindness, and the son I was about to lose all over again. 3 evenings later, the doorbell rang. Brenda pushed past me, furious that her credit card had been declined, that accounts were frozen. Ryan trailed behind, miserable. I let her rant burn itself out, feeling nothing but a weary sadness. Then I looked past her, straight at my son. "I'm just protecting your mother's legacy," I said quietly. "Her entire legacy. The parts you know about, and the parts you don't." I watched the words land on him in a way Brenda's greed could never touch. "Are you sure you know what that legacy is, son?" He had no answer. I told them the accounts were under standard administrative review during a leadership transition, and walked away, leaving the power in that room permanently shifted. The next morning, I summoned an emergency board meeting. Brenda would read it as weakness, the last gasp of a grieving old man. She had no idea she was walking into an ambush. I wore the charcoal suit Carol bought me for our 35th anniversary. Armor, not clothing. In the boardroom, Brenda opened with a rehearsed speech about my missed meetings, my grief, my fading edge. Ryan has the vision. It's what Carol would have wanted. The board looked uncomfortable. She thought she'd won. Then I turned to Kenji. He opened 6 binders and put B&R Consulting on the screen. Invoice after invoice for services no department head had ever heard of, all approved by Ryan's signature, each one just under my sign-off threshold. Then the money trail. $250,000 toward the Aspen Chalet, $160,000 for the Porsche, $75,000 in personal credit card debt, and a final $42,000 moved into a joint savings account the day after our first confrontation. A final slide. $812,450 in stark black numbers. Brenda screamed fraud accusations at me. Ryan crumbled entirely, sobbing that he'd only signed what she told him to sign. I laid the timeline bare. March, April, May, June. Each invoice dated against the worst weeks of Carol's illness. While I held her hand as she told me she was scared, they were funding a ski chalet. While we brought her home for hospice, they signed for a Porsche. This, I told Ryan, is the legacy you were trying to protect. The board voted unanimously 3 times, terminate Ryan's employment for fraud, permanently bar Brenda from the company, and authorize Kenji to pursue full civil and criminal action. Security walked them out. Brenda left with her head high, still performing. Ryan had to be lifted from his chair, sobbing my name until the door sealed him out of my life. Alone afterward, staring at Carol's empty chair, it hit me. I hadn't been fighting this war alone. Every step, I'd been following a map she'd drawn before she died. Her private calls to Kenji. The old ledgers, her warning about Brenda. She'd known she was dying, known grief would blind me, and spent her last strength arming me from the grave. I wasn't avenging her. I was finishing what she started. A week later, Kenji arranged a final meeting. Separation terms, he called it. Brenda arrived diminished, still trying to negotiate, still certain this was about the stolen money. Ryan looked like a ghost. Kenji opened a blue folder. Carol's will, executed 2 months before her death, 2 months before her diagnosis had even progressed. It revoked all prior wills. Liquid assets to me, as expected. Brenda relaxed. Then Kenji reached Article 4, her controlling 51%, inherited from her own father and protected by prenuptial agreement, would transfer into a new entity, the Peterson Legacy Trust, restricted by what Carol called the bloodline clause. It would only pass to an heir who could provide definitive genetic proof of being her direct blood. Brenda laughed it off, a fancy way of saying it goes to Ryan, our son, get a needle, we'll prove it right now. Kenji had anticipated exactly that. 3 months earlier, Carol had insisted Ryan get an executive physical, worried about his health, she'd said. In truth, she'd authorized a private comparative DNA panel against her own sample. Kenji read the result flatly. 0 common genetic markers. Probability of maternity, 0%. Ryan simply broke. Brenda's mind scrambled for an explanation. An affair, a hidden mistress. And I gave her the truth. A mistake I'd made 45 years ago, before Carol and I married. A woman who never wanted the child, only money. Carol had found out, forgiven me, and loved that boy so fiercely she made him hers in every way that mattered, except blood. And her will was built on blood. Brenda shrieked for an answer. If not Ryan, then who inherits? The door opened, and a woman in scrubs and a white coat walked in. Early 40s, Carol's exact eyes. Kenji introduced her. Dr. Ann Wallace, cardiothoracic surgeon. The daughter Carol had given up for adoption at 19, long before she ever met me. Found and reconciled with her mother 6 months before Carol's death. The verified sole heir to 51% of Peterson Freight. Brenda's mind simply broke apart, insisting it was fraud, an actress, a conspiracy, until Kenji's quiet word, ironclad, ended it. She collapsed into ugly, ragged sobs, the sound of someone who'd bet everything and lost it all. Ryan sat frozen, whispering that she wasn't his mother, that none of it was real. Justice moved slowly but completely after that. The civil suit was filed before they'd left the parking garage. Criminal charges followed: grand larceny, wire fraud, conspiracy. With every account frozen, Brenda turned on Ryan instantly, filing for divorce and claiming victimhood. She walked away with nothing but legal bills. The Aspen house and Porsche were seized to help cover the stolen funds. Ryan didn't fight. He pleaded guilty to everything, a broken man with nothing left to lie for. Given his cooperation, and perhaps a quiet plea from his father, the judge spared him prison, 5 years probation, 2,000 hours of community service, a restitution plan he'd likely pay off for the rest of his life. At 40, he took a warehouse job and learned, for the first time, the feel of honest work. Months later, in a Chicago spring, I walked the depot grounds beside Dr. Ann Wallace. She'd flown in for the quarterly board meeting, not to run the company, her calling was surgery in Philadelphia, but to serve as chairwoman, protecting her mother's legacy from a distance. She would have been so proud of you, I told her. What you do, saving lives. She told me she was proud of you too, Anne said, smiling exactly like her mother. She said you were the only man she ever met who built an empire and kept his soul. She planned all of this, I said. She saved her company. I think she saved me too. She saved all of us, Jake, Anne said, looking up at the Peterson freight sign. She gave us the chance to build something new, something honest. The grief never fully leaves. But for the first time in a long time, it wasn't the only thing I felt. Carol's legacy wasn't just steel and concrete and 51% of a company. It was standing right there beside me, and it was only just beginning. A legacy built on deceit is a house of cards. Carol's real power was never just her forgiveness. It was knowing that truth, however painful, is the only foundation that lasts. Tell me, was it her forgiveness 40 years ago, or her final move in the will, that was Carol's greatest act of all? Let me know in the comments, and if you believe truth always finds a way, hit like and subscribe for more stories like this.